Welcome to Ask DW on YouTube. I'm Nicole Froelich. This is a show where your questions take center stage. Today, we'll be taking your questions and comments on the advances by Syrian rebel forces against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Rebels have now taken control of the city of Hama, marking the latest gains in a week-long offensive against Syrian government troops. Hama is a strategically important city in the northwestern part of Syria. It's about 140 kilometers from the country's second largest city, Aleppo, which rebel forces took control of last week already. Now, these are the first images to emerge from Hama and have been supplied by the rebels' media organization. DW, I need to tell you, cannot verify when and where they were taken. The fall of Hama is another important setback for President al-Assad. So the question now is, will Assad fall? And joining me here in the studio to take your questions is DW reporter Ghazia Ohanes and Bente Schelle, the head of the Middle East and North Africa division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Germany. So good to have you both. So while we wait for the first user questions to come in, I would like to get your take on how this advance has been pulled off. How could they take Aleppo and Hama at such speed?
It might look as if it's coming as a surprise. However, they have been preparing for a long time. They have been training for that moment, and pressure also grew on the very HTS, so that is the controlling faction in Idlib. There was public pressure saying, why do you have all these men under arms if you don't make any advances? And on the other side, we also have to see the regime of Bashar al-Assad has been very weak for years now, and they are withdrawing nearly without a fight.
Ghazia, you have an eye on the map because there's a lot of moving parts right now. Do you maybe want to walk our viewers through where things stand as we speak?
Of course, like you said, Nicole, things are moving really fast. The latest update we had was from Hama, and rebels say now they have full control of Hama, and we can see that it's marked in blue on our map. It's the lowest point that they have reached, and now they're making their way to Homs. And the factions, of course, I'm not going to go into detail about all the different colors on this map. We'll discuss those later on in the program, I'm sure. But they made their way from Aleppo, and the next stop is Homs. They've already said this. They've said, Homs, you wait up. Our troops are arriving on their Telegram channel. So they've sent the signal, and they're on their way at the moment.
Bente, what does losing Hama and Aleppo mean for the Syrian regime?
It is a huge thing because Aleppo, you know, the regime fought for years to get control over half of the city, over eastern Aleppo, until in 2016, in December, they took it. And now it has been a question of days to take it for the rebels. Hama as well, it was a city in which the revolution was very strong in the beginning. I think Hama saw the largest protests of all Syria, but then people got scared because there is a memory of how the regime crushed a rebellion in Hama 30 years, 40 years ago. So everything calmed down, but I think it is really a major thing to take this city that never was under rebel control before.
Mm-hmm. It's a hugely symbolic city for the rebels, right?
For exactly that reason, right? Historically, they endured a lot of crackdowns. The most notable of that was in the 80s by Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad. It was called the Hama Massacre, and estimates say 10 to 40,000 people were killed in that massacre. So obviously it's extremely pro-opposition, and now we're already seeing pictures and videos on their Telegram channels of celebrations in the city of Hama after the rebels took control.
Thank you for the time being. I want to bring in another guest. We're joined now by Fawaz Gerges. He's a professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. Fawaz, it's so good to have you with us. I want to start by asking you the same question I asked our panel here in Berlin. How were the rebels able to pull off such a speedy offensive?
We had known that the Assad regime was very vulnerable, that the Assad regime was a shadow of its former self. What we did not really realize is that the state capacity has been degraded considerably in the past 3 years. There is no state capacity. Point one, American sanctions have really exacted a heavy toll on the state. It has pauperized most Syrians, including the followers and supporters of Assad. For your own viewers, the United Nations estimate that 80% of the Syrian people require humanitarian aid. So really, the state does not have capacity, point one. Point two, that Israel has been really hammering Israel nonstop in the past 3 years, and in particular in the past year. It has destroyed units, Iranian assets, weapons depot. It has really undermined and weakened the military infrastructure. And thirdly, I would argue that Assad's major allies, the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah, are preoccupied somewhere else, in the Ukraine, in the killing fields of Gaza, in Lebanon. So the reality is, what the opposition has been trying to do is really biding its time and really waiting for this particular, moment of opportunity to strike. And of course, Turkey has provided a great deal of support for the opposition, because what we're seeing on the battlefield, great organizations, willpower, well-dressed, well-fed. The Syrian army, the Syrian soldiers are not getting even nutrition because they're really on the verge of starvation. You have leadership, you have willpower, and here you have it now. The unthinkable a year ago could really happen in the next few weeks and next few months. That is, the opposition takes it all, recaptures not only Aleppo and Hama, but even Homs, and then, going all the way to Damascus.
Yeah, we'll talk about what the future might look like in a second. I do have a question for Ghazia, because you have been in touch with people on the ground. How do they feel about the rebels taking over Aleppo, taking over Hama?
There's a lot of mixed feelings in Syria right now, and that mostly falls down on what sect and minority. Syria is extremely diverse, and how people feel usually depends on what community they belong to. And everybody right now is still cautious, watching what is happening. Things are moving very fast. There can be power changes any moment in any direction. But in Aleppo, I've been in contact with people who were extremely panicked in the first few days, not knowing if the regime was going to have another siege on Aleppo like we saw the last time, or if there was a threat from extremists entering the city. But so far, we haven't seen many incidents of that in Aleppo, particularly. They have been going into, for example, churches and reassuring the community that you can have your masses. Our problem isn't with the civilians. We're not going to take revenge on people, but we're really going to fight this regime. We don't know if that will still be true later on.
If they can be trusted,
but right now, that seems to be the case. There have been some incidents, unverified, but there have been reports of Yazidi men who were killed for their faith, for example, by militants and Kurds. Now, the situation might be a bit different for people outside of the Abrahamic religions, because extremists don't really want to coexist with them still.
Yeah.
I would like to add
yes,
on something that causes also insecurity in Syria, because we're also talking to our partners. And when we see what the regime and the Russians have been doing, well, they have not been doing anything to push back against the rebel advances. They have been bombarding cities in Idlib. They have been bombarding Christian neighborhoods in Aleppo. So there are also people who are confused. They thought they are maybe not well off with the regime, but they are kind of protected. They felt surprised by the regime leaving without giving them any warning, without offering any security for them, and then coming back with bombarding their places. So that is also a danger that many people are afraid of.
Yeah, as always, the civilians are the ones caught in the crossfire.
And as always, we see punishment and revenge on the side of the regime. It's really a pattern that we've been observing. They normally don't focus on militants and military advances. They punish civilians. And this is also why they have been focusing on targeting hospitals once again.
We do have a first user question from those watching us on YouTube, and I encourage you to keep the question coming. But here is the first one. Aaron Richard writes, what does Hezbollah do in Syria? Let's look at the Iranian influence, Fawaz. What can you tell us about that?
The reason why many Syrian army units have folded very quickly because their most skilled and hardened fighters, Hezbollah fighters, and Iranian leadership are no longer in Syria. Israel has really targeted the Iranian leadership assets and basically positions and even the embassy. And Hezbollah has pulled out most of its forces of Syria in the past year because Hezbollah was engaged in a major war against Israel. So the reason why the opposition has been able to make such stunning advances, because there are no boots on the ground. There are no hardened boots on the ground. It doesn't matter how much air power you have, unless you really have, skilled and determined fighters to really basically stop the advance. I think it's impossible to stop the fighters by air force alone. And even Russia itself, Russia has pulled out most of its forces to the Ukraine in the past 3 years. It has only an air force contingent, a small air force contingent. So without really boots on the ground, without the allies like Hezbollah and the Iraqi militiamen and Iranian support, I think the Assad forces are not really, they don't have the stamina, they don't have the motivation, they have been weakened, they don't have capacity. And that's why I think if I were Assad in Damascus tonight, I would be sleepless. I would realize this could be it. The implications, the consequences are extremente important, not just for Syria, but for the entire geopolitical, security architecture.
Yeah. Bente, I'd like to extend that question to you. To what extent has Assad's grip on power been made possible exclusively by the backing that he's gotten from outside powers like Iran and Russia?
Well, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London already in 2013 published a study saying the Syrian army is down to half of its size. And you couldn't rebuild because it would be a war in which you would need much more manpower. It was really also with huge losses for the regime, defections, etc. So I think it was impossible to rebuild the forces. And this is why Hezbollah was so important. Hezbollah was the force to really be there on the ground. They never wanted originally to go to Aleppo, but they were sent there. And for the people on the ground, I think that was really a bad experience because Hezbollah is very hierarchical, very determined, and this is why sieges that were imposed by Hezbollah, that were guarded by Hezbollah, were stronger than any others. The population in the city of Madaya, for example, has this memory. This is where people starved to death because Hezbollah would get this as a task, and they do it much more disciplined than the very corrupt Syrian army, where you could always get your way through. And I think really for the regime, it is a problem that they dissolved the monopoly of power they had. They outsourced it to Hezbollah, they outsourced it to other forces. And in the past years, in regime areas, you'd see a mixture of militias and mafia-like structures. So security was something that was not organized top-down in the regime areas any longer. And this is now coming to haunt Assad.
Another country heavily meddling in Syria is Turkey. Erdogan has now come out asking for a political solution to the conflict. A little late in the game, Ghazia, isn't it?
That's correct. Now, Erdogan in the past has been very much on the side of Assad must go. That has been his stance in the beginning of this conflict. He's always stood by the rebels, refused to have dialogue with Assad. That was up until last year when he suddenly had this openness to hold talks with Assad and one-on-one talks with Assad, which worried the rebels. But Erdogan always assured them, said, I'm still going to be backing the rebels. And we're seeing that now. Erdogan will say those things. He will say, oh, let's have a political solution in Syria. But at the same time, Turkey backs opposition factions. Some of them are on direct payroll from Turkey. That is the Syrian Free Army, they're called. And they're working also with HTS, the group that's leading this offensive. They're not the ones that are carrying out the offensive, but they've joined in as well. So there's direct involvement there in a way. And Turkey's calling for negotiations now too, but it might just be too late for Assad at this point.
Yeah, we do have another user question that I'd like to bring in. Nilay Chaturvedi asks, if Assad actually falls, as you just pointed out as a possibility, will Syria head the way of Libya when Syria today is in a far worse position compared to Libya in 2011? I'll start with Fawaz and then take it over to Bente.
Is that the Syrian people have a binary approach. Sadly and tragically, they are pressed between the rock of the sectarian-based Assad regime in a sectarian dominant opposition. This is the reality. Without an inclusive, without an open, without a forward-looking, a tolerant opposition, I think Syria is bound to fall into the same situation like Lebanon and Yemen and Libya. Now the opposition has coalesced together against Assad. They have a major enemy. But once Assad falls, and Assad has not fallen yet, we should not all be groupthink, right? Because the reality is there's a long way. But the reality is if the opposition basically strikes a fatal blow against Assad, my take on it is that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham will most likely take ownership of Syria. And regardless of the changes that we have seen in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, I'm not really convinced so far that a Salafi Sunni-dominated group could offer Syrians. Syria is one of the most, you might say, many ethnicities and communities, and so that's what I fear. I fear that without really a strong opposition, the nationalist opposition, the pluralistic opposition, we might end up like Iran, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Think of how the Iranian Revolution was never Islamic at the beginning, but the Islamics and the clerics really took ownership of the revolution less than a year after it has happened, because they are strong, they are committed, they are motivated, they have an ideology that's willpower, and they're willing to die for their ideas and ideology. And that's of course, I'm speculating a great deal, but many Syrians I know, and I know many Syrians inside Syria, they're not really, they don't support Assad. They're very anxious and concerned about the future, and they have the right to be.
Yeah. Bente, do you share that concern?
I share that concern, obviously, because it is a great risk. But I would also like to shed some rays of hope here, because we've been talking to so many people and also working with so many people over the years. And one thing that I really find astonishing is the strength of civilians in all the areas of Syria. It's not just the north, where now HTS is very much in our focus. It's also the south, where the Druze particularly are located. There have been protests for over a year in the province of Dara, where the uprising started, in the province of Sweda. So Assad is not firmly placed here as well, and it's a completely different composition of population there. Also in HTS areas, repressive and autocratic as HTS is, it is really a dictatorial approach that HTS has been taken. However, protests in Idlib also never ceased. Protests against Assad and at the same time against HTS and its leader Jolani. So we should not underestimate the spirit after 13 years of having been targeted with barrel bombs, with torture, forced disappearance and chemical weapons. I think it is amazing, and therefore I think there is hope. It's just that now it would need very carefully to be accompanied. I think we should listen to Syrians who want a different future for their country. And as for Libya, for many years, it was a talking point between us and Syrians as well. And for many years, they would say, well, if only it could be like Libya, because the difference to Libya was that there was not such an asymmetry in the conflict. There was not one force having an air force and a hired air force, like from the Russians, bombarding its own population. So the scenario of Libya, of course, is nothing desirable. But in comparison, I think the suffering of the Syrians keeping Assad in power and having all this external support and the foreign fighters on the regime's side has really created a situation much more terrible for civilians on the ground over the past years.
Yeah. We talk about HTS a lot. Ghazia, could you walk us through what we know about this group at this point?
Yeah. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, I will go a bit into their history. You might know them by their previous name, Jabhat al-Nusra. So they came from ISIS fighters in 2012, and then a year later they distanced themselves from ISIS and pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda. So they are extreme, and then later on they went on to also distance themselves from al-Qaeda, but they're still classified by the US as a terrorist organization. So they're extremist in their ideology. And yes, they have changed in recent days, like we said. They have come out and said, we don't want revenge, we want to show mercy, but their expressions are still hyper-religious. It does not look like they want to create a secular society with secular rule, but rather they want to establish a Sharia law in Syria, which would be problematic, especially for women, for minorities, for all the diverse groups that exist within it. Yeah. And this, if they are going to keep their word. So there are many concerns that they could actually become more extreme, kind of like we saw with the Taliban. They came and they made all these promises that they would let women go to school and study, and then once they ruled, that all changed quite fast. So we might see a similar situation in Syria, and that is the fear.
Yeah. We have another question coming in from our YouTube community. David Lopez Cuello asks, how can Russia aid Assad considering it's already strained with the war in Ukraine? Do these rebels pose a direct threat to Russia in case they take control of Syria? Fawaz, what do you say?
The setback, the Assad setback, is a big setback for Russia and a major setback for Iran. Iran and Russia have been the two major allies of Assad. In fact, just for your own viewers, Russia's military intervention in Syria in 2015 turned the tide of the war in Assad's favor. I doubted very much whether Assad could have survived in 2015, after 2000, without really the pivotal, the firepower of particularly the Air Force and the leadership and what have you. The reality is Russia cannot do much about what's happening in Syria. You need boots on the ground. You need paramilitary forces. Russia, in fact, is desperate for boots on the ground in the Ukraine. It's relying now on as you know, North Korea. There are at least 10,000 North Koreans. At the end of the day, look what I really hope for, an ideal scenario. An ideal scenario is that what has happened in the past 2 weeks is really changed the balance of power inside Syria. I mean, could Turkey and Iran and Russia and other powers really use this particular moment as a catalyst to really reshape the political scene in Syria, as opposed to all-out war that destroys the country and the country descends into basically a long war? Because Assad has no choice now. He has basically, the writing is on the wall. And if Turkey and Iran and Russia and other powers really come together, they could really force Assad to accept the inevitable, that is a new political order in which all opposition, the Islamists and the Syrian Nationalist Army and other minorities really become an integral part. And for him, it's over. He has been in power for a long time. So this is an ideal situation. But in the Middle East, sadly, one of the lessons we have learned is that irrationality is as important as rationality. So I don't expect Assad to basically accept any major change, transformation of the political system in Syria.
Yeah. Bente, Proton, another one of our users, asks if there is a risk of Iran's involvement in saving Assad by sending regular troops or commandos. Iranian troops in Syria, official troops, do you see that happening anytime soon?
Well, I doubt it, because for Iran, Syria really was a kind of death trap. Iranian troops and Iranian affiliates have been hit really hard in Syria by Israel. Fawaz mentioned it earlier. And Russia has always been opening the airspace. So imagine being with two allies and one allows the other to be decimated. That is quite a strange scenario already. And I think with all the losses that Iran has suffered, let's just look at the entire leadership of Hezbollah that has been killed over the past years, and not exclusively in Lebanon, but in Syria. I think they know whoever they will be sending and the higher ranks they might be sending to Syria, they will not last. So I think they'll be very careful what to do about Syria, and I doubt that they will send any important troops to save Assad. Also, he has not been speaking out for Iran. When Iran was under attack by Israel, he didn't lift a finger, he didn't make a statement. So it's also an ally that is not really easy.
Right. We're talking about a lot of countries meddling in a foreign country. Where does the U.S. play into this picture? Because, you know, they're always around.
Yeah. The U.S. backs the Kurds in Syria. It's a coalition of different Kurdish groups called the Syrian Democratic Forces. And together they control about 25% of Syria. And Kurds make up around 10% of Syria's population. So it's actually quite a powerful force. The U.S. also has a base in southern Syria, a Taif base, where there's a coalition that's led by the U.S. So the U.S. also has a lot of presence in Syria, but recently with this offensive, it's kind of taken a step back and said that they're not directly involved. Now, Kurdish forces have had some skirmishes with the Syrian army, but they've justified this, saying they're afraid of kind of an Islamic state coming back, making a comeback. So they've said it's a self-defense, but they might just be taking the opportunity of a weakened state to claim more territory.
Yeah. We have another comment. Warco writes, and I'm assuming he's writing from the U.S., if America intervenes, we're the bad guy. If we don't intervene, we're the bad guy too. Bente, is the U.S. living up to its responsibility in this conflict?
The U.S. has been really in a not very strategic way when it came to Syria. And particularly under Trump, we saw very different movements he did when he was in presidency the last time. For example, at one point, he bombarded the Syrian Air Force, and that was a one-off thing. He never did anything against or pro them again. But then he also said he'd withdraw U.S. troops, and actually he pulled out quite a number of U.S. troops already that were supporting the SDF in the Kurdish areas. This is a very mixed message he has been sending. And so I think now we first will face a phase of transition from one government to the other in the US. That will be quite a weak point. And with Trump, it's very difficult to foresee whether he will have a strategy altogether for the Middle East as well as for Syria.
Yeah. Fawaz, where do you see Syria on Donald Trump's list of priorities?
Let me just add a few footnotes about the U.S. and Syria.
Absolutely.
The big point, the overarching underlying idea of the U.S. is conflicted about Syria. On the one hand, they have imposed some of the most severe sanctions against the Assad regime. They don't like Assad. They want Assad out. On the other hand, the Americans are very anxious about Hayat al-Tahrir, and Hayat al-Tahrir is basically considered a terrorist organization, as you know, by the United States and Britain. They're very anxious about because they don't think that Abu Muhammad al-Julani has changed his skin or his ideology or his views. But at the same time, here is the United States is also delighted that what has happened in the past few days is a major setback for Iran and for Russia. And that's exactly what Antony Blinken said a few days ago. It tells you a great deal about the geostrategic rivalries in the region. On Trump's motto about Syria, he made it very clear, which it tells you a great deal about his racism. He said there was nothing in Syria except death and dust. Death and dust. And he pushed very hard to pull out the 500 American forces from Syria. And it was a major, basically, infighting between himself and his defense minister, which he resigned as a result of that. So I don't expect any major role of the Americans because the Americans have so much on their plate, as you know, in Gaza, Iran, China, the Ukraine, what have you. Really, at the end of the day, what we're going to see in Syria in the next few days, next few months, the battlefield. The battlefield, the balance of power on the battlefield will determine basically the political settlement, that is the balance of power. And again, to come back to the fact, it seems to me that the odds are against Assad at this stage. The momentum is with the opposition. They have the wind, to their back. Unless something happened, which I doubt very much. As to Iran, sending forces to Syria, even if they want to. Israel has made it very clear that they will basically shoot down any kind of, in fact, when one or two Iranian planes tried to land in Damascus 2 days ago, few days ago, the Israeli Air Force basically prevented them from doing so, and they turned back to Iran. At the end of the day now, it seems to me, the only force that could help Syria are the Iraqi forces, the Iraqi militiamen, the popular mobilizational forces. But even then, I don't think it would be enough to change the balance of power on the battlefield at this stage.
Gazia, Nilay Chaturvedi asks, if Assad falls, could Kurds finally turn their autonomous region into de facto country and gain legitimacy? You showed us the map before. Maybe we can pull that up again to see the Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria.
Yeah, that would be useful to pull up the map. Can we have the map?
Let's see. We still do it. We have it. We have it. It's coming up. But maybe, you know, we can start talking about what the situation is and if an Assad defeat could actually lead to these territories being more formally recognized.
So, of course, that's what Kurds want, but this is an impossible scenario under Turkey's watch. Turkey does not want that because then that would set an example for Kurds within Turkey that they could also have their own autonomous region. So Turkey wants to have control into these regions, to be able to go in and control which kind of fighters are taking refuge there. Turkey already accuses SDF of, which controls that entire area, of housing PKK terrorists that it considers terrorists, Kurdish fighters. So even though that is what Kurdish factions want, the power dynamics are now changing. Kurds used to control way more territory than, you know, rebel fighters who only had less than 15% of Syria before this offensive. But now that is all changing really fast. The Turkish-backed rebels are gaining more power, more control, and that means actually the Kurdish influence within Syria would likely weaken as a result. Now, Kurds are trying to at least capture some of the territory from the regime in this meantime, but it seems as long as, you know, the HTS and the FSA, the Turkey-backed rebels, take control of Syria, we might not be able to see an autonomous Kurdish region. But it's also hard to say how these different groups are going to get along and form a government together, perhaps in the future.
You're nodding. Where do you see this going for the Kurdish factions in Syria?
I think this is maybe the main question. How will Kurdish-Arab relations work out now in Syria's north? Because if they get into conflict, the whole thing might take a different turn once again. But I think for the Kurds, there is a lot at stake. Even if they don't have a real perspective on having their own state and their autonomy being very strong, many of them also suffered under the Assad regime. Many of them, hundreds of thousands of Kurds in Syria, are without nationality because it was withdrawn from them in a census in 1963. So there have been aspirations for getting recognized, for being part of Syria and being recognized not as secondary citizens, but to really be part of control and have their own rights. And I think if we now look at the map you just showed, we see that it's not only the originally Kurdish areas in the very north along the Syrian-Turkish border that they controlled recently, but with the SDF, they controlled the entire area east of Euphrates, which is marked here in yellow. And in this area, we have two advantages, which is water. It's a lot of fertile land that is there, and there are also the oil and gas resources of Syria. So I think they have now a much more powerful position to negotiate about what role they can take in the future Syria than they have before. So maybe they will be able to bank on that without knowing what exactly they can achieve.
Mm-hmm. Fawaz, we have another question on Russia's position in this conflict. Is there a scenario in which the Russians make a deal with HTS or any other terrorists, as this user is calling them, to keep their TARDIS port, for that has been a huge strategic win for them?
It's an impossible mission. The opposition are viscerally opposed to Russia. They loathe the Russians because the Russians have used, force indiscriminately against, in particular, Air Force They bombed civilian targets, hospitals, medics, first responders. So they're really, in fact, they will do everything in their power to exact vengeance on the Russians in Syria, even though they want the Russians out of Syria. They want the Iranians out of Syria. So Russia is a major, major loser in this thing. I want to come back to the question of the Kurds a bit, just because I have a different reading, actually. The Kurds' aspirations for both autonomy and a state of their own will be shattered into a million pieces. Make no doubt about it, that the pro-Turkish opposition is determined to undermine any kind of Kurdish aspirations. Turkey has two goals in Syria. The first goal is to return the 3 million refugees, Syrian refugees, into Syria. And this is really because it has weighed down the socially and politically and economically in Turkey. But the second important strategic goal of Turkey is the Kurds. Turkey is very much concerned about the empowerment of the Kurds. Turkey is very much concerned about the aspirations of the Kurds. In fact, the opposition, the Syrian opposition, the pro-Turkish opposition, has been attacking Kurdish position and will most likely, given the important role, the pivotal role that Turkey really exercises on the opposition, I doubt it very much whether the Kurds will have any role to play. As they were told in Aleppo, you have two choices. You either die or you leave, and they decided to leave. So this is why the situation, the political map, the social map of Syria really is extremely, it's a toxic cocktail of choices and uncertainties. And everything we say now, sadly, we've learned from civil strife and civil wars. Everything we say, basically, because of the fog of war, we do not know what's going to happen in Syria because we don't know who's the winner will be and what will happen as a result of the battles that are taking place in Syria as we talk, you and I.
Where do you see the international community's role in that, Fawaz?
I teach international politics, international law, but I've become very cynical about the word international community. It no longer really exists. We used to, talk about international community and society. I think what we are seeing now is that the international system, the rules-based international liberal order has been really ruptured and ruptured big times. You're talking really about the return of great power politics, whether you're talking about the United States or you're talking about Russia, reassertion, or China. So really, in a way, when we talk about the international community, we're talking about the key powers. That's the United States and Russia. But I don't think the United States is interested, and Russia is doing its best to really stop the advance of the opposition. So at the end of the day, really, Syria, it's the geopolitical powers inside Syria. You're talking about Iran, you're talking about Turkey, and you're talking about Qatar. These are the powers that they are meeting this week, as you know, in Qatar. Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Qatar, in order to talk about the political future of Syria, but events are moving very quickly, so I doubt it very much whether this meeting that will take place this week in Qatar will make a big difference in the situation.
Bente, the UN Secretary General said that the flare-up reflects the bitter fruits of a chronic collective failure of previous de-escalation arrangements. Do you agree? And if so, who's to blame?
I agree. I just don't agree with the wording because de-escalation is a word that has been tarnished in the Syrian conflict exactly by Iran, Russia and Turkey, who had a kind of separate format, the so-called Astana talks, in which they agreed on de-escalation zones. They called them like that, but actually these were the zones that were besieged and they came under heavy pressure and heavy attacks just to take them back one after the other. So I think really the Secretary General is right. And when it comes to well, we thought it was a frozen conflict and we could ignore it. No, it was not. It was not frozen for Syrians on the ground, because I think the death toll on an average basis every day was 20 to 30 people. So it was really a violent conflict all the time. It was not frozen, and we didn't find a way to really approach it when there were several opportunities. There was a UN Security Council resolution 2254 just to pave the way for a political transition. This was what the Geneva process was there for. It was never implemented, and the process was used by the regime to pretend it was negotiating while seeking a military solution. There were also other efforts. I mean, there were calls for a no-fly zone that would have not possibly changed the conflict, but it would have protected civilians. But none of the measures, neither by negotiations or protective measures, ever was implemented. And I think really we are seeing now that this might lead into more displacement, more violence, and it might make it all more difficult to solve.
Yeah, we're nearing the end of our show, but we're still getting so many questions from our users. Hassan Roz has a question for Mr. Georgis. He says, asking how he sees the future of Syria, and I can already tell you that I'm going to want to know the answer from you two as well.
I could say that I am optimistic. Syria has been a humanitarian catastrophe. Let's remind our viewers, almost 500,000 Syrians have been killed, 1 million injured, 6 million refugees, and you in Germany, you have more than 1 million Syrian refugees. Displacement, 80% of Syrians are on the verge of starvation. Syria, I mean, think of this cocktail, what's happening. Syria is no longer a sovereign state. You have the Russians, you have the Americans, you have the Iranians, you have Turkey, you have ISIS. We hardly talked about ISIS units in many parts, sadly, in Syria, and they're still carrying out attacks. So at this particular, I mean, we are blinded by the dust. It's very difficult for me because I really can't, we don't have clarity. Because, you know, the dust has to basically, at least, I mean, I don't know. I really, truly, I don't know. I don't have any clarity about Syria, but I fear that what we have seen in the past, 20 years or so is not reassuring. And because both sides, they see the conflict as existential. And because of the existence of communities and minorities, and because of the violence that has been visited on Syrians and the fear of the other.
Bente, where do you see this going? Is this the end of Assad's rule?
That might be the end of Assad's rule. I think it is pretty close. He's under heavier pressure than ever before. And even though I can totally see where Fawaz is coming from, and realistically, I think there are more bad options than good options, I really would like to highlight the strength of the Syrian people and the creativity and the unimaginable they have been going through. So I think there is still a chance to turn things into a better future.
Yeah. Ghazia, you are from Syria. What's your wish for your country, your hope at this point?
I would say my approach is cautious optimism. I don't want to get carried away. I do see things improving, at least economically. If the fighting does stop at some point under a new government, even if it is extreme, I do see some improvements there. But I am very worried for minorities. I am worried about what this means for civil rights. I am relieved on the political front. I think it might lead to more openness where people can just freely express themselves. I mean, we talked about protests against HTS as well. So they do allow criticism. We might see a lot of those changes, but I would stay cautious of being too optimistic at the moment.
Thank you so much, Ghazia Ohanes, Bente Schelle, and from London, Fawaz Georgis, for sharing your insights and your experiences. And of course, to all our viewers, especially those who, chimed in and sent in their questions, thank you so much for your active participation in turning Ask GW into this platform for genuine dialogue and understanding that we aim for it to be. Bye-bye.